That scar, Lieutenant? Souvenir from a car accident? Or did you finally learn what a real knife feels like? The question dropped through the maintenance bay like a blade laid flat against a table, and 31 soldiers and technicians went still to hear what came next. Colonel Grant Hollis had a voice built for change of command speeches, pitched now for an audience of enlisted mechanics and one uniformed woman standing over an open rifle case. He stood with his arms crossed, chest heavy with 18 years of ribbons, the kind of stance that assumed the whole depot, the whole base, maybe the whole Pacific Theater, existed to hear him talk. His aide laughed first. Then 2 sergeants near the tool crib. The laugh moved through the bay the way laughter does when it's waiting for permission, and Hollis had just given it. The AC unit rattled somewhere overhead. A wrench dropped onto concrete near the tool crib. Nobody moved to pick it up. The bay smelled the way every bay like it smelled. Gun oil, solvent, the faint burnt metal edge of a grinder somebody had used an hour ago and not quite finished cleaning up after. His shadow crossed her workbench before he did. Long, deliberate, cast by the floodlights, and it fell directly over the rifle components she was cleaning. She was 29, maybe 31. Small enough that Hollis had to look down to sneer at her. And she wore a plain flight suit, with no rank insignia, no name tape, nothing that told the room what she was or why she was there. Her sleeve had ridden up an inch while she worked, showing the edge of a scar along her forearm, jagged. The way shrapnel leaves a person, not the clean line of a scalpel. She didn't pull the sleeve down. She didn't look up. Her hands kept moving on the disassembled rifle with a rhythm too even to be nervous, and too fast to be careless. The kind of grip that comes from doing this 10,000 times in the dark. She did not flinch. Not even a little. Hollis stepped closer, close enough that his shadow swallowed the whole bench. I asked you a question. She set down the bolt carrier, looked up. Her eyes were flat, unbothered, the eyes of someone doing math in the back of her head that had nothing to do with him. Higher clearance than yours, sir. You just don't know it yet. 8 words. No volume behind them. She went back to the rifle before he could answer. The bay didn't laugh this time. In the doorway, an older man in fatigues had stopped mid-stride, a clipboard against his hip, watching. Command Sergeant Major Walt Duggan was 61 years old, 34 years into a career that had run through 3 wars and more depots than he could count, and something about the woman at the workbench had snagged his attention the way a burr snags a sleeve. He noted the grip. He noted the stillness. He said nothing. The pen tucked behind his ear didn't move. Not yet. Hollis straightened, jaw working. He didn't like being handed something he didn't understand, and he liked it less in front of an audience he'd assembled himself. He turned it into a joke. Loud. Easy. Built to make everyone forget she'd landed a hit. Higher clearance. Right. Somebody get her a coffee before she overheats that big brain of hers. The laughter came back, thinner this time, more obligation than joy. She didn't look up again. She breathed in through her nose, 4 counts, held it. 4 counts out, held it, and returned to the rifle in front of her like the room had already emptied. Duggan watched her hands. He'd seen that breathing before, once, a long time ago, from men who didn't come back to tell him where they'd learned it. The bay went back to work slowly, the way a room does when it isn't sure the show is over. Somewhere near the back, a young corporal leaned toward his neighbor and asked, low, who she even was. Nobody had an answer. Her file, when anyone bothered to check it, listed her as attached personnel, temporary duty, no unit of record. The kind of paperwork built by someone who understood exactly how uninteresting it needed to look. Hollis walked the length of the bay once more before he left. chest out, satisfied with himself in the particular way of a man who mistakes silence for surrender. He didn't look back at her. He didn't need to. In his mind, the matter was already closed. By 1400, the story had already outgrown itself. In the mess hall, 3 different versions of the joke were making the rounds. She'd fainted. She'd cried. She'd been sent home in shame. None of them true. All of them useful to somebody. By the time it reached the far tables, it had grown a 4th version where she'd tried to pull rank on the colonel and gotten laughed out of the bay for it. The story didn't need to be true. It only needed to be repeated, and repetition was doing the work truth couldn't. She sat alone at the end of a long table, working through a tray of institutional-grade eggs that tasted like nothing in particular, and she listened. Not to the jokes, to the room. Who laughed loudest and who didn't laugh at all, who glanced toward the colonel's table before speaking, and who didn't. She was building a map nobody else could see, and every laugh at her expense fed it another line. She did not react. Not at the coffee joke retold for the 4th time. Not when a private accidentally set his tray down 2 feet from her like she carried something contagious. Not when the volume of a nearby conversation dropped the moment she stood to bus her tray. Then rose again once her back was turned, as if she couldn't hear a room the way she could hear everything else in it. Duggan noticed that too from across the room, and did not sit with her, because sitting with her would have meant a question he wasn't ready to ask out loud. He bussed his own tray a minute after hers, on a path that happened to take him within 4 feet of where she'd been sitting, close enough to see that her hands, even alone, even unwatched, hadn't once stopped moving with purpose, folding a napkin into a precise square, aligning her utensils, small motions that looked like nothing, until you noticed nobody had taught her to do them that way. Nobody taught habits like that. They got drilled in, 1 repetition at a time, until the body stopped asking permission. The afternoon brought new indignities. At the range, a young instructor named Ellis handed her a stripped M110 sniper rifle and told her to reassemble it if she could handle real equipment for once. She had it fully reassembled and function checked in 11 seconds. Ellis stared at the rifle, then at her hands, then said nothing for the rest of the session. Later, off to the side, he told Duggan he'd only ever seen that grip, that exact angle of the wrists, that spacing of the fingers, at 2 schools most people had never heard of, and neither school officially existed. By 1600, the depot's authentication terminal logged something else worth noticing. A monthly access code that took most operators 5 minutes to input correctly took her 9 seconds. First try, no hesitation, like she typed it every day for years instead of once a month like everyone else. The systems clerk mentioned it to nobody. Duggan heard it anyway. He was good at hearing things nobody mentioned. At 1622, the fire alarm went off across the depot, a scheduled drill nobody had bothered to warn the transient personnel about. The bay emptied in the usual scramble, shouted headcounts, someone's coffee knocked off a bench, a line forming crooked at the muster point. She was the only one who didn't scramble. She moved to the exit at a fast, level walk, counted the room with a glance before she left it, and fell into the muster line already knowing where the gaps were. Her posture stayed exactly regulation the entire time. Not close to it. Not approximately, exactly, the kind of exact that only comes from years of drilling until the body forgets it has other options. An instructor running the head count clipboard paused on her for a full 2 seconds before moving on. He didn't know why he'd paused. He just had. Duggan watched from the muster line's far end and added it to a list he'd started keeping, without quite admitting to himself that he was keeping it. The way she flinched at the alarm's first blast. Exactly once. Then, Never again. As if she'd recalibrated on purpose and decided the noise wasn't worth a second reaction. The way she knew which exit was fastest, without reading the posted map like everyone else had to. Small things. None of them proof of anything. All of them pointing the same direction. There was a fifth thing. One Duggan didn't know about yet. 3 nights earlier, alone in the depot's equipment office after hours, she had cross-referenced the ordnance log against a shipping manifest that didn't match it by 4 crates, all signed off under Hollis's authorization, all logged as destroyed in a training exercise that records showed had been canceled. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone. She didn't need to. It was already sitting in a report queued to transmit the moment her check-in window opened, and Hollis had no idea he'd handed an investigator a reason to look at his own paperwork instead of hers. By late afternoon, the pattern had a name even if Duggan hadn't said it aloud yet, and he kept turning it over anyway. The grip on the M110. The 9-second code. The alarm. The equipment log he didn't know about but somehow still felt the shape of. The way you feel a storm before the sky changes. He'd learned a long time ago that the biggest tells were never the loud ones. Hollis, for his part, had decided the coffee joke wasn't enough. By 1758, a small crowd had gathered outside the admin building because word had gone around that the colonel was finally going to settle the ID question himself. He arrived with his aide and 2 security personnel, the kind of formation meant to look official even when it wasn't. He stood in front of her with his chest out. "Let's clear this up," he said, loud enough for the 20-some people already watching to hear every word. "Full credential check. Right now. If you've got a clearance higher than mine, Lieutenant, this should take 5 minutes." She controlled her breathing. 4 in, hold 4, 4 out, hold 4. "Copy," she said. Nothing else. The interrogation that followed happened in a borrowed office with a folding table and a government laptop that took too long to boot. Hollis ran it himself, enjoying every second, an audience of 1 security officer standing by the door to make it feel official. "What were you doing at 0500 this morning?" "System diagnostics." "Why? At 0500? "Light traffic. Better performance data. Convenient hour to be alone in a secure facility. Wasn't alone. There's always someone monitoring. Monitoring by whom?" "Above your clearance, sir." Hollis set down his pen harder than he meant to. The security officer by the door shifted his weight. The first sign all afternoon that the room's temperature had changed, and he'd noticed it before the colonel had. Hollis pressed on anyway, flipping to a fresh page, like a fresh page might change what was written on the last one. "Your personnel file lists you as a contract systems technician. 2 years in that role. Nothing before it. That's what the file says." "Is the file wrong?" "The file says what it's supposed to say." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're cleared for, sir." He didn't like that answer either. He didn't like any of her answers, because none of them gave him anything to push against. She breathed her 4 count under the table where he couldn't see it, and let him talk himself into a corner, 1 question at a time. By evening, Hollis had escalated it into something with paperwork behind it. A formal security review. Credentials pulled pending verification. Her badge and ID confiscated as a precaution. Her temporary quarters reassigned to a room closer to the duty desk, which everyone understood to mean closer to someone who could watch her. She surrendered her badge without a word. 4 in, hold 4. 4 out, hold 4. Duggan watched the whole exchange from the hallway, pen finally still in his hand, and for the first time in 34 years of service, he felt something he hadn't felt since 2 friends didn't come home from a bridge nobody was allowed to name. He didn't say anything. Not yet. He wrote 1 line on his clipboard and folded it into his breast pocket where nobody would see it. Somewhere in a data center 4 time zones away, a check-in monitor logged its first missed contact of the day, and nobody in the room had any idea what that meant. They didn't call it a cell. They called it a holding room, which was a windowless space 8 feet by 10, a metal bench bolted to the floor, concrete walls painted the color of old teeth, and a narrow strip of frosted glass near the ceiling that let in exactly enough light to tell her it was still daytime outside. The air smelled like bleach fighting a losing battle against something older underneath it. Someone had left a folding chair outside the door as if that made this a conversation instead of a detention. A single fluorescent tube buzzed overhead, one end flickering on a delay, like it hadn't fully decided whether to work. This is the moment where anyone watching from the outside would assume it was over. Caught. Investigated. Confined to 4 walls and a locked door while a colonel decided what to do with her. Except rooms like this only work on people who don't already know how they end. She had sat in worse rooms than this one, in countries she wasn't allowed to name, and walked out of every single one of them on a schedule nobody in the room but her had set. She sat on the bench with her hands loose in her lap. Nobody had thought to take her watch. Nobody ever did. She checked it once. Military time, glowing faintly in the dim light. In 23 minutes, her handler at Naval Special Warfare Command would flag her first missed check-in of the deployment. The kind of flag that triggered a phone call, then a second phone call, then a name nobody in this building was cleared to hear. In 63 minutes, a protocol she'd set in motion 3 months ago, before she ever set foot on this base, would activate on its own, whether she was free by then or not. In roughly 2 hours, Colonel Grant Hollis was going to learn the difference between the authority he thought he had and the authority that had been quietly outranking him since the moment she walked onto his depot. She breathed. 4 in, hold 4, 4 out, hold 4. None of the 3 timers depended on her doing anything at all. That was the part Hollis hadn't understood when he pulled her badge and locked a door that wouldn't hold anything he actually needed to worry about. She hadn't planned an escape. She'd planned an inevitability 3 months ago on a different continent, long before she ever heard the name Grant Hollis. Outside the door, she could hear boots on concrete, unhurried, someone pacing the hallway like they weren't sure what else to do with themselves. She recognized the rhythm. Duggan, he didn't come in. Not yet. But he stood outside that door longer than his shift required, and some small, uncorrupted part of Grant Hollis's command was already starting to notice things it couldn't explain. A duty clerk mentioned, quietly, that 3 separate calls had come through the switchboard in the last 20 minutes asking for a status update nobody had requested a status on. Nobody could say who they were from. Nobody wanted to ask twice. The first crack came from Duggan, and it came quiet. He found Hollis in the corridor outside the holding room, radio traffic already picking up around the base in a way that didn't match a routine credential review. "Sir." Duggan kept his voice low, the 2 of them alone for the moment. "I'd be very careful about this one." Hollis waved it off. "She's a technician with an attitude problem, Sergeant Major. Nothing more. 34 years, sir. I know what I've seen." Duggan didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He walked away before Hollis could ask him to explain, because some things aren't explained. They're recognized, and recognition doesn't come with footnotes. He went back to his quarters that night and did something he hadn't done in years. Pulled an old footlocker out from under his rack and dug through it until he found a folded copy of a professional military education handout from a course he'd taken a decade ago. the one with the redacted case study everybody in his cohort had argued about for a week afterward. He'd forgotten he still had it. He unfolded it under the desk lamp and read the timeline again for the first time since the course ended. A compound, 11 hostages, a breach team whose names had never been released, one operator wounded and still holding the route open. He'd lost 2 friends on an operation nobody let him talk about, years before that course, on a bridge that didn't appear on any map he'd ever been issued. He'd never let himself ask whether the 2 things were connected. He let himself ask now, sitting alone under a bad lamp at nearly midnight, and didn't like how quickly the answer arrived. 90 minutes after the badge confiscation, 3 black SUVs came through the base's main gate without stopping at the checkpoint the normal way. A call from the provost marshal's office had cleared them through before they arrived. 4 flag officers stepped out in service dress, unhurried. The kind of unhurried that only comes from people who already know how a situation ends. A 3-star from Special Operations Command, a 2-star from the Judge Advocate General's office, and 2 more whose branch insignia nobody at the gate recognized quickly enough to log correctly. Behind them, 2 men in plain suits who didn't introduce themselves to anyone and didn't need to. Hollis met them at the door of the admin building, straightening his uniform on instinct, already rehearsing an explanation for a question nobody had asked yet. Behind him, his aide had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of a junior officer recalculating every joke he'd laughed at that day. Colonel, the senior general, didn't offer a handshake. Where is she? They didn't say her name. They didn't have to. Hollis opened his mouth to explain the credential review, the security concerns, the perfectly reasonable process he'd followed by the book. The general didn't wait for any of it. He simply walked past him, toward the corridor, and the other 3 flag officers followed without a word. Boots on tile, the only sound in a building that had gone very still, very fast. Word of 4 stars walking a hallway moves through a base faster than any alarm. By the time they reached the far door, every office along that corridor had someone standing in its threshold, watching, none of them quite breathing normally. In the holding room, an aide unlocked the door and stepped back like it might bite him. She stood as the flag officers entered, calm, hands loose at her sides, watch still on her wrist. The senior general, 3 stars, silver hair, the look of a man who'd spent 30 years learning not to react to anything, crossed the room and stopped in front of her. He didn't salute yet. He reached for a tablet one of the suited men handed him, thumbed through 2 screens, and turned it so the light caught the image on the display, an old case file. The kind stamped in red block letters across the header. The classification level alone enough to make the aide by the door go pale, just from glancing at it sideways. On the screen was a diagram, a wound pattern, hand-drawn decades ago by a field surgeon and scanned into a digital archive that maybe 40 people in the country were cleared to open. A jagged line along the forearm. Shrapnel, not surgery. The exact shape. The exact angle. The exact length. The general looked at her arm, at the scar, then back at the screen. Operation Kestrel Bridge, he said, and the room detonated. Not loudly. Silence has weight, and this silence had all of it at once. A tablet slipping from someone's hand and clattering against the floor tile, the sound echoing like a dropped magazine. Somewhere behind Hollis, a chair scraped concrete as someone stood up too fast. The overhead hum, barely noticeable a minute ago, suddenly seemed deafening, the only sound left in a room that had otherwise forgotten how to make noise. Kestrel Bridge wasn't a rumor. It was a case study. Every officer candidate in this building had studied it in a classroom, watched the sanitized version in a professional military education slideshow, memorized the timeline for an exam. The extraction of 11 hostages from a compound nobody was supposed to know existed, executed by a breach team whose names had never been released. One operator critically wounded and still completing the mission before evacuation. It was taught at 3 service academies. It had its own chapter in a Special Operations Doctrine Manual, reprinted every year, redacted in all the places that mattered and studied hardest in exactly those places. Hollis himself had sat through a lecture on it once, years ago, as a junior major, and remembered thinking the operator in the case study sounded almost fictional, too precise, too composed under a wound that should have taken her out of the fight entirely. He had never once wondered what had happened to her afterward. Nobody, in 14 years, had ever known the name of the operator who took shrapnel across the forearm, holding the extraction route open long enough for the last hostage to clear the bridge. Until now. Somewhere in the back of Hollis's mind, a slide from that lecture surfaced without permission. A redacted silhouette. A timeline. A single line of text he'd copied into a notebook and never thought about again. Operator sustained shrapnel laceration. Right forearm. Continued mission. He looked at her arm again like the sleeve might rearrange itself into a different answer. It didn't. The general's hand came up first. Slow, deliberate. The crisp, formal angle of a salute given to someone who outranked the room, whether the room understood it yet or not. Then the second general. Then the third. Then the fourth. A half beat behind, jaw tight like he was fighting something in his own chest. Every person in this room, including myself, answers to her authority, the senior general said. Commander Elena Voss, call sign Widow 6. Kestrel Bridge and 4 operations after it that none of you are cleared to hear about. Hollis's face went through 3 things in under 2 seconds. Confusion, denial, and something underneath both that looked, for the first time since anyone on this base had known him, like real fear. His hand twitched toward a salute of his own, and then stalled, half raised, frozen between instinct and disbelief, until one of the suited men cleared his throat, and he finished the motion. Late, sloppy, the least military salute anyone in that hallway had ever witnessed. He didn't say anything. For once, he had nothing to perform. No audience left to play to. No joke left that would land. No room left that hadn't already decided who he was next to who she'd always been. Outside, word moved through the depot faster than any joke ever had. By the time she walked out of the holding room, escorted by 4 flag officers instead of 2 security guards, the maintenance bay had gone silent in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with math finally resolving itself. 31 soldiers and technicians stood at attention without being ordered to. Ellis, the range instructor, saluted so hard his arm shook, already replaying 11 seconds of rifle reassembly in his head and understanding, finally, exactly what he'd watched. The young corporal who'd asked who she even was stood the straightest he had all deployment, jaw tight, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to ask. Duggan didn't salute right away. He waited until she was close enough to see his face, and when she did, he raised his hand slowly, not because a general had done it first, not because protocol demanded it, but because 34 years of instinct had finally been given a name to attach itself to. He'd chosen it. Nobody had ordered it out of him. Somewhere behind his eyes, a bridge he'd never been allowed to name finally had a shape he could live with. She returned the gesture with the smallest nod. It was the only conversation they needed. Grant Hollis's investigation didn't end quietly, but the parts that mattered happened without an audience. In the days that followed, an inspector general's team arrived, and the first document on top of the stack was a report on 4 missing crates of ordnance, signed off under his authorization, logged against a training exercise that had never happened. He had spent the entire day trying to prove she wasn't who her file said she was. He'd never once stopped to wonder what she'd found while he was looking. The investigation widened from there, a pattern of complaints filed against him over 3 previous postings. Complaints that had each, somehow, been quietly closed before they went anywhere. A favor traded here. A signature overlooked there. None of it enough on its own to end a career until all of it was finally read in the same room by the same set of eyes. His credentials were suspended pending review. A separate line of inquiry opened into the missing ordnance, one that would take months to close and would not end with him keeping his commission. His orders, when they finally came through, reassigned him to a post where his rank would matter to almost no one. Effective immediately. No ceremony, no farewell formation, no cameras, no dramatic arrest. Justice, this time, wore the shape of paperwork and closed doors and a security escort walking him to his own quarters to collect his things. He tried once to find her before he left the base, and found Duggan instead, standing in the hallway like he'd been waiting there specifically. "She doesn't want to hear it, Colonel." "I wasn't going to apologize." "I know," Duggan said. "That's why she doesn't want to hear it." She was already 3 steps past caring how it ended for him, because her mind had already moved to what came next. That evening, she stood alone on the depot's back access road, where the fence line gave way to open desert, and the sky did the only performing it needed to do. The sunset stretched orange into violet over the ridgeline. No clouds, no ceremony, just colors settling the way it always did, whether anyone below had earned a quiet moment or not. Her watch read 1943. Duggan found her there, eventually, and didn't say much. He stood beside her for a while, the two of them watching the light change over the ridge, and when he finally spoke it, was only 4 words. "Wish I'd known sooner." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. He nodded once, like the silence had told him everything, and walked back toward the depot alone, leaving her with the sky. They mocked her scar. They forgot it was the only thing in the room more decorated than any of them. Justice isn't loud. It's patient. Somewhere in a folder she wasn't cleared to close yet, one name from the Kestrel Bridge network remained unaccounted for. A financier, last seen on a grainy surveillance still taken from a rooftop 3 years ago, in a city she wasn't allowed to name out loud even now. Someone had funded the cell that put 11 hostages on that bridge in the first place. That person was still out there, still funding someone else's bridge. Somewhere, Hollis had cost her nothing but a day. The name on that rooftop had already cost her a scar, and it wasn't finished collecting. Her orders for the next assignment were already waiting, encrypted, on a device Hollis had never thought to confiscate because he hadn't known to look for it. She'd read them in full before the sun finished setting. 4 in, hold 4, 4 out, hold 4. Whatever came next would ask more of her than a mocked scar and a locked door ever could, and she was already, quietly, ready for it. Tomorrow brings new ghosts to hunt. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to MVP Stories for more.